This is Platform Diaries with Shane Williams, who chews the fat with entrepreneurs, startup founders and thought leaders on what it takes to traverse the wall between startup and scale up.
So you've built a scalable product and proven that there's a market, but have you considered how you'll scale the business? Welcome to Platform Diaries. I'm your host, Shane Williams. My guest today is Nigel Dalton. Described as the godfather of Agile, Nigel is a social scientist in the digital transformation and operations team at Thoughtworks. We discuss why platform strategy is so important for scale-ups, some of the common mistakes organizations make when choosing and implementing platforms to scale, the importance of continuous improvement in Kaizen, dealing with uncertainty, and the implications of complexity theory. I trust you'll enjoy the interview. So Nigel, welcome back to Season 2 of Platform Diaries.
Well, I'm delighted to be here as your New Zealand correspondent in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, and chatting to you.
Awesome, mate. All right, so today I wanted to, re-prosecute a conversation that we had a couple of years ago, maybe with a bit more depth and maybe a couple of years of additional learning, and that is the importance of a platform strategy. And particularly now, as I think more about it, in the journey from startup through scale up to unicorn. Because I know you and I have both worked in, more than one unicorn and seen the challenges of either getting it right or not. And I think there's a lesson there at some point on the journey, or I guess at every point on that journey, there's an opportunity, right? So maybe I could just start with, why do you think a platform strategy is so critically important for scale ups?
Well, we often say that timing is the secret of good comedy. Timing is the secret of growing a business without question. And if I had $1 for every person I've advised, helped, or even myself, having, since I last saw you, deep into a startup, a mobile coaching app. And it really is when you get to a moment that you go, I wish I'd done that, or we don't have time for that, you're too late. And this is what catches out growing companies, whether they're small, medium, or large. The business case to start building operational excellence presents itself at a point when you're starting to get into the chaos and you're starting to find that you could do with some cost saving, you could do with some reuse. And of course, the early days of a starting up business, it's let 1,000 flowers bloom, as Bob Catter said. And it's all about growth and attention to customer and experimentation and all those kind of things. And, the essence of the book that I didn't finish, while you did an excellent job finishing and publishing and distributing yours, it still is be one step ahead. And that one step ahead really takes you through, by all means, with a startup, just build a giant kludge of a pile of code and get the darn thing working and test and learn those kind of things. 5 minutes later, it's about, it's hard to get users onto the system. Could we not do that manually? And those are the things I think an experienced head can bring to the table in terms of someone who's done that before. And so our tiny little startup, it's called PeopleSpot. They have free advertising for me there, right there. We started thinking about that ahead of time and going, okay, well, what's our platform for security and users? Because we could just do that really in a lightweight way, and in the end went for commercially available platform Firebase. So a Google platform that just gives people who are scaling up security, user identity, logging, tracking, monitoring, all those kind of things for almost nothing, Shane. That's the astonishing thing, is that implementing a platform within a small but growing rapidly business actually doesn't need to cost you a lot more. But it can feel unintuitive to people. So for me, that's it. One step ahead, because at the point you really need one, you won't have the time to think about one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about that, and I think, you made the point about being, I guess, I'm going to use not words you didn't use, but being scrappy in the early days, right? Get your product to market, prove that there's actually a market for it, and you don't necessarily need on day one all the back-end office tools and the supporting security tools and whatnot. But once you've proved you do have a market, then the ability to scale your business is a whole different kettle of fish, and not necessarily something that startups will be good at, right? We're good at scaling product, not good at scaling businesses.
That's exactly right. The additional thing the pandemic has brought us is a complete shortage of skilled people to help us do what we used to call the handrolic processes that you might do in place of having a good platform for onboarding users, which is our kind of challenge right now. And look, success for us is getting clients with 10,000 users. And it's like, okay, well, we could copy and paste that, I suppose. There are enough hours in enough days, but is that a really practical use? And what's the integrity of the result? Have we doubled up on some? All those kind of things. So, yeah, look, I think it's not. Platforms used to be something were enormous for large companies only to be part of their evolution to go to platforms to start saving money. And that was certainly our experience at REA Group, for example. The platforms there were mega scale. We're talking ERP platform, we're talking CRM platform, and then things like data and security. Yes, very, very large scale. But gee, they were a bit painful to retrofit, weren't they?
Yeah, and not necessarily cheap either.
That's the funny thing. So yeah, I probably paid a lot less for the use of Firebase with our startup than somebody like REA attempting to undo so much to engineer a platform. And that's probably the other hidden benefit. If you like time spent undoing business processes and half-baked systems you did implement, it feels bad when you're in the process of maybe you're at, like that classic moment of raising money because you've actually got a successful startup and you want to go to the next stage. People want to know, am I investing in something that has scalability, that if you get a customer with 1,000 users tomorrow, how are you onboarding them? How are you monitoring them? How are you giving them reporting? How are you even accounting for it? And you'll wish at that point that you'd actually put a little bit of time in. I mean, the great news is that whether you're an e-commerce player or all those kind of things, I think the number of platforms and ease of access to them has grown considerably in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at a investor conference just last week in Sydney and had a good opportunity to talk to a whole section of people I'd never spoken to before in the investment space. And some of the questions that sort of were coming up during those conversations were exactly that. It was, when we're investing, we're looking at not just the scalability of the platform and the product, but the scalability of the business, and do they have the right people involved and those sorts of things. And it sort of begged the question, what does their tech look like that sits around the piece of software that they're building? So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I just want my one sort of platform to think about if you are in this state and going, well, maybe I should think ahead. Something like knowledge management. Now, knowledge management, like you just say that in a group of grown-up IT people and they all moan, oh my goodness, not KM. And, that was a lot of software sold in the 90s around documentation. Oh, we're Agile now. We don't need documentation. But I can tell you for value of your enterprise that some kind of knowledge management becomes vital as you start to share and grow. And the pandemic has proven this because you don't have walk-up access to your neck-bearded expert in that particular field. And so things that were old are new again.
100%. And I think knowledge is an interesting one, right? Because there's also that element of, well, once you start onboarding thousands of customers, then how do you provide customer support? Where's the IP exist that not every support experience is going to be by a bot, right? So when there's a human on the back of it, how do they know how the thing works and what your business process looks like and all those bits and pieces?
And I think the divergence of expectation has been immense over the last couple of years, where people expect something better than a rubbish bot answering their call and saying, oh, we'll email you back. That's the likes of Shopify. All those kind of people have really upped their human support game. Been working on a very, very large enterprise project with Stripe, for example. If you want a payments platform, I really can't say enough as to how good it is and how easily integrated. You know what their most gigantic strength is? Customer service.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? And their API is already so well documented and plugged into so many off-the-shelf other platforms that it's kind of a no-brainer, right?
It is, and that's a really good sort of space to think about platforms and the generational nature of them. And what are you going to bet on becomes the stress point where they need to hire a bloke like you to actually give them some advice, because there's new things coming at us all the time, and everything does have a life cycle. It's very difficult to maintain over a decade a growing business.
So here's an interesting one. We've talked a couple of times about people or organizations who've had to revisit these things that when they got bigger and how difficult that is. Can you think of who's doing it well in terms of platform strategy?
It's interesting to me now. We both have a gentleman's certain age where we've watched an entire Australian e-commerce digital sector grow up from nothing in the 90s. And I'm fascinated by the companies who are the granddads of e-commerce in 2000, REA Group, Car Sales, Seek, even, Redbubble and Varto, some of the wunderkind of the Web 2 world, all coming back round to the table and go, okay, it's time. And what we built, our stacks, our software we integrated, is not meeting the customer needs in 2022. I think they're all doing a great job of walking up to this. And their approach is very interesting. They can afford to hire grown-ups to help them do that, but they're not wallowing in self-pity that all of that investment in software and capital and people and all those kind of things is wasted. It's got them through that journey, but what got them here won't get them to 2030 and competing globally in one way or another, or driving an engine of new ideas, which is going to come from data. It's going to come from security. It's going to come from all those things that we know are the next big mega trends in the world. I'm admiring them because they've got hundreds, if not thousands, of staff. So they have a change management problem. And I'm talking about people, change management problem. They have an architecture problem. They've got to need to get clarity of strategy, and they've got competition of every kind, from the niche players to Facebook.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you think about, I often draw the life cycle of a digital business, and you've got, there's like an S curve, and you've got this idea of the startup, the scrappy, get shit done, let's prove we've got a product. And then the S curve kind of tapers out a little bit. And then if you solve the growing pains problems, you then end up with this in the scale up space. And I kind of think that it's about picking your timing about when to solve some of these problems, so that growing up phase in the middle of the S curve is as limited as possible. But then you look at the 20-year-old digital businesses, the first generation of e-commerce, and they're almost going through the cycle again, just at a much larger scale with a lot more problems. Because, you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of customers, and you're trying to re-platform at the same time. It's almost generational.
Yeah, this is my frustration with Western businesses, Shane, I'm a big fan of the Lean. Since I last saw you, I've become a director of the Lean Enterprise Institute. I think the main thing I love about that Japanese-American hybrid mindset around the way work works is the acceptance of a continuous improvement mindset. So if I could do one thing, it would be eliminate the word transformation from our vocabulary in Australian businesses, because it's a belief that one time only you will take this, and through adding, it might be platform software or whatever, one time only, we will transform and never need to change or adapt again. And it's mythical. It's not how it works. It's exactly those sigmoid-shaped curves, one after another, and you need a constant vigilance, as they said in Harry Potter. But you need this attitude of continuous improvement, which of course is Kaizen in the lean world. And if you can put yourself some money aside to do that as you go, I think you'll create a scalable organization. In some ways, our accounting practices aren't friendly towards that. CapEx versus OpEx, those kind of concepts. CapEx is we'll build this once and amortize the costs over 5 years as the stream of benefits is able to be tracked, and it doesn't really walk up to the fact that the world changes.
It's interesting. I mean, people listening won't be able to see this, but I'm looking at a beautiful butterfly over your left shoulder up on the wall, and it kind of reminds me, if you think about transformation, that works when you go from a grub to a butterfly to dead. And if the business model is to go grow up and then die, then the one-time transformation analogy probably works, right?
Yeah, look, there's a wonderful old story. What's called the Regeneration Trilogy is the book, and Pat Barker wrote it. Must be 25 years ago. An astonishing story of a psychologist treating World War I shock victims in the front line and their officers, and it's based on a true story. of a kind of a sanitarium style home for the bewildered hospital, which this doctor's trying new techniques on to try and give therapy to people who had a terrible time on the front at the Somme or one of those, that war 100 years ago wasn't pleasant. And the doctor concerned is based on a real doctor, and he comments that the largest problem with the treatment is that it's going from caterpillar to butterfly, is that they cut open the chrysalis, the moment of metamorphosis, and are deeply disappointed to find, not a mythical creature, half caterpillar, half butterfly, but DNA ooze. And this is one of the dramas of growth companies and, evolution or transformation, whatever you want to call it, is we panic after 8 months of implementing Salesforce. This is a mess. Like, you've undone every single business process we've had. People are angry about the change management and having to actually fill in call reports. And you haven't got a new system. We're still running both. Cutting the chrysalis open is one of the most amateur errors you can make in the course of a decent sized project. But again, shout out for my daytime employer, Thoughtworks, who we've moved away from using this word transformation because of that exact thing. It raises expectations in executive shareholders that it's a one and done, and you got your butterfly job done. And talk about evolution, which of course is a longer game. And it's a better word. The virus has given us a tremendous metaphor for evolution that's shorter. And what are we on? That variation BA2 or something of Omicron? Tremendous genetic adaptation and evolution in short scales, RNA-based evolution in short scales. So using that as a bit of a teaching example these days.
That's interesting. So we talked about that being, I guess, a common mistake. What are some of the other common mistakes you reckon businesses make in this space?
I think the toughest one is the number of options you have to think about. And you suddenly very quickly, I have this wonderful slide that looks back over the last decade. It's, this is the Andreessen decade, really. And 10 years ago, 2011, end of 2011, Mark Andreessen said that software is eating the world. He was right. He was shifting the whole portfolio at Andreessen Horowitz from a data center kind of physical infrastructure investment profile to software as a service, the kind of the early platform stuff. And people were curious. He wrote a column in, I think it might have been the Wall Street Journal, about, understand this. Software is about to eat the world. That's why I'm putting all my money on it. He was 100% correct, but what he didn't say was good software is about to eat the world. And I've got this picture of what choices you had available around, say, customer management in 2011. I can name Salesforce, and maybe Microsoft had a platform way back in the days. You didn't have and Sage, perhaps, I don't know.
Siebel?
Yeah, big stuff. But, you could get down to matching the needs of a customer for a platform around customer pretty quickly because you didn't have to boil the ocean of options. The last count on the slide that's 2019, there's like 5,500 options to navigate through which platform to deploy to improve your customer records. There's your problem. Who are you going to get to help you with that mess?
Yeah, have you got a divining rod? Because I'd like one.
A dartboard, maybe? Just like kind of go, one of those. And so making those choices, so suddenly your due diligence becomes really important because you are betting the company on it as much as, oh, sure, we'll replace it again in 2 years' time. Sure, you will. Yep. And you're altering business processes. You're needing human change, which, of course, is my space as a social scientist. And that's the challenge, I think, is now there's just a wealth of choices that is really hard to navigate. And people choose the wrong thing. And once you've chosen the wrong thing, it's a heavy commitment.
Yeah, the selection of platforms is really fascinating. You think about, well, it's not just we need a customer platform. That sounds great in theory. And the other theory that, these things are loosely coupled so we can just swap them out. Yeah, okay, well, you've got the entirety of your business using them, so you've got the change management strategy. Take that aside, then, well, what does the rest of your business do and how interconnected is that?
Millions being wasted, probably hundreds of millions being wasted. Of course, everyone's now pretty hot on data platforms because we've got machine learning and we've got options for product development, customer service, everything using bots and algorithms and those kind of things. They're pretty problematic for a couple of reasons. One, there's so many of them to choose from. In all honesty, it's pretty hard to go past Google or Amazon particularly if you're a cloud-based company. But I honestly think the quality of the data stored in Australian data lakes, data warehouses or otherwise, the cheaper thing to do, my cheeky advice to someone thinking about data warehousing and data lakes, is migrate nothing. Just leave it. Leave the old one alone and start afresh. If you're a decent sized business and you architect great, data feeds from the right systems and you're asking the right questions of what you want of that data, you might as well start again. In a year, you'll have enough data to know your customer well. And I see so much money spent angsting over losing data that has come from 3 generations of disparate systems. Yeah, they're wasting their money and time. Don't fret on migration. It's still the same in the simplest of systems, things like intranets. Bring nothing over. Make people start again. If it's important, they'll put that knowledge in there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Where I was going to ask you next was, what do you think the steps to success are? And it almost sounds like from a data perspective, there's already 2 morsels. The one that occurs to me is, if you're picking platforms, often what gets missed is, has it got a shiny presentation or salesperson that can show me how great it is? That'll win the hearts. Then there's interconnectivity. What's it look like? But what often gets missed, I find, is, are there people who can help you with this stuff? Like, it's great to go, like, as you said, Google, Amazon, right? There's umpteen number of people who either understand it or are on the journey to understanding it. And there's a bunch of niche players that service really specific niches that are, if you've got that niche, probably really good. But you're thinking about, great, well then, who knows this stuff? Can I hire people to get it? Can I hire people who are going to be interested to learn it? The real fascinating element to platforms is, you don't get the value out of these things unless the humans that are running them and expanding them and, continuously improving them exist. And I think that gets overlooked.
Oh, it's critical. I mean, with PeopleSpot, the little coaching app startup, we're at exactly that point. Do we go HubSpot or Zendesk? I'm familiar with both, and we started out with HubSpot because we just needed to experiment with how we thought the flows from a support thing to a ticket to an allocation would work, and where would we store our customer information, because a certain amount of that was going to be just important for who's phoning who, kind of the simplest things in a startup. And we learnt about our needs by doing. I don't think if we'd sat down, and largely as a group of non-tech people, it's made up of people who are not engineers. We learnt as we went, and then in fact, the choice has been to move away and go to the mighty Zendesk for some of their automation and their integrations. And that actually suits us much better. But initially we believed all the amazing, I don't know if you've ever encountered the mighty HubSpot machine, mate. You'll get an email twice a day asking if you need help. It is an incredible sales infrastructure, that's for sure. And they're both great choices. I love the fact that Zendesk's here in Melbourne. But it's really hard. And I think it causes people to avoid making these choices. Do you see that? Is that a valid option where people just go, actually, it's too hard, I'm going to do nothing?
There's plenty of that goes on. I think the trouble is deciding to do nothing is still a decision. And it's almost like, well, you're just waiting for the problem to get bigger until the point where you have no choice but to do something. And then it's expensive, hard, all those interesting things.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of human embarrassment involved of having to go back to your CEO or back to your board and go, actually, look, we need another $250,000 to do a system. Well, haven't you already got one? And yeah, we have, but the world changed. And I think, the core nightmare with this absolute blossoming of choices is making the wrong choice. The content management system for our little startup, that we angsted over that for some time, and well, there's a ton of expert advice. If you Google which content management system for my mobile startup, and it's not helpful, Shane. It actually makes it worse. And you got to do those things and draw up your needs and try and make a decision. But yeah, we've gambled a lot on that. All of our content and intellectual property is now in there. Hope it works. Hope they stay profitable.
Well, it's interesting, right? You talk about, we were talking about steps to success, and I think you were alluding earlier to an experimentation mindset around, well, we're not sure, we'll try something and we'll see if it fits, and if it doesn't, we'll pivot. And I think that's probably the antithesis of the conversation we're having, right? It's that how much earlier in the growth phase of the organization can you make some of these decisions, because they become a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult the bigger you get, right?
Yeah, delaying. There's a cost of delay, which, look, if there was one thing I've really loved learning about in the last year is a Kiwi bloke, actually. Ironic that I'm here. I'd love to meet him. Is Josh Arnold. He spoke at Agile Australia in 2017. So he's one of the world's sort of premier thinkers on prioritization of what to do next using a thing called the cost of delay. And it's hard. The maths is a little challenging, because it's like you have to do some rigor to your analysis to go, if I don't do this now and I need to come back to it to do, what is both the opportunity cost and what will be the physical cost of undoing a lot of things later. It's like technical debt, where you do something now that you know is a shortcut and you're compromised for later. The maths is similar in that way, but it's a tremendous thought exercise to go, yeah, if I don't do this now and we just keep on storing our customer records in Google Sheets, what'll that mean later on in terms of getting it done when we're scaling and we just can't find someone to think through the whole, how do we want to use that data and processes? It's better to go early, I think, in some stages. And maybe that you can characterize going early as an experiment. But I hate migrating systems and change. I'm as change averse as any human being, and here I am, something of an expert on change management. But no, humans don't like it, and it feels like waste. That's our challenge. When you do an experiment and it doesn't work, we're wired to think that was a waste rather than an investment or a bet that we made. There's our problem.
Yeah. I think the interesting, I guess, insight for me around that piece of learning was finance people struggle with it. Well, if I don't spend the money now, I'm not spending it. It was almost that mentality of, I can see there's going to be a cost in the future, but that's, for lack of a better term, a choice we can make to do or not do in the future. So I don't need to think about it now. It was almost, yes, I get that's going to cost me more later, but that's a tomorrow problem.
Yeah, look, finance is the absolute cutting edge. I think of this, use a lovely term from the change management field. Another Nigel Thurlow, who's written a lovely book in the last year around change and change management and complexity particularly. He uses the word liminal a lot. He and Dave Snowden are big fans of this word. And it's the chrysalis phase of change. It's the mess you get as the chaos between one state and another. And you've got to prepare for it. You've got to be ready for that not feeling that great. I think accountants and accountancy are in a very liminal phase of their role in organizations, where it was very clear, black and white, ones and zeros with 2 decimal points, what the finance team in an organization's job was in 1995. I mean, I remember them. I chose not to do accounting because my math's not that good, Shane. So I became a behavioral economist who can wave his hands and have 3 answers to every question. Accountants, it's very precise. And now we've entered an era with so much optionality and so many, an algorithmic era of accounting where it is just not precise. And the discomfort I see is expressed in business cases, expressed in procurement departments attempting to nail down contracts with vendors that are brutally unfair because we're in VUCA times now. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You need that iterative approach. But gee, that doesn't lend itself well to credits and debits.
I think that little morsel of IP there is almost the bookend to your upcoming book, the complexity and of optionality. And this is me just giving you a little bit of a jab in the ribs from our earlier conversation.
You'll have a second book done before I get my first one out. I guarantee you that's the thing. But what I appreciate about it all, what hasn't changed in the last couple of years of us all working remotely and finding new ways of working, is people. People still need to collaborate. People who've done a good job of getting to know their customers, perhaps through click and collect and online, know your customer. My father-in-law, rest his soul, was a grocer, and his superpower was knowing his customer. And now we're here in an era where, the banks are absolutely investing billions in KYC, partly for compliance reasons. They need to know if they can really afford that loan. That's the magic of platforms, is the potential to know your customer, to understand their struggles, and really grow your business sustainably. At scale, you need somewhere to store that data. It's not like Barry was, who could store it in a little notebook, or he had a prodigious memory for names, faces, and which breakfast cereal you preferred.
I think where it becomes interesting is it's probably even more than store it, right? It's that recall and drawing the connections between stuff, right?
That's the modern era. I love that. And this is why complexity theory has found its day at the moment. It's absolutely booming, when the truth is ecosystem thinking and, everything being connected in one way or another was hot in the 70s. 50 years later, because of the web, literally that everything's connected to almost everything, and a customer review is just a few clicks away. Complexity theory and complexity thinking is becoming extremely important. So where I see the most conflict in modern business, most pain, is where people have abstracted away their complexity and gone, no, just keep it simple, stupid. I used to get hammered by that. My boss going, kiss, kiss, kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. Gee, I probably wreaked some havoc for some people 6 or 7 years later by abstracting away the complexity and describing the work as a linear process, merely complicated. A going to B, going to C, going to D, and there's never any variations to that process. And you do think of the poor people who actually administer CRMs and ERPs and all those kind of things. The amount of time a finance person spends journaling things that don't quite fit the linear financial process, because there's loops, and there's stuff coming in that's new from the side. And because we met in the world of finance, which is your mastery of platforms in that space, and I'm always astonished with that as a really good example of how hard it is to change stuff and how hard it is to implement platforms. Because they really just want to weld something in and it never change. Organizations change. Do you remember the fear in the eyes of our colleagues when we said, okay, new org design, we need to move some cost centers? Like that, I might as well have said, I need to pin you to a stake in the desert and let the vultures eat you. Because that would have been just as attractive as the idea of having to recut a budget at the half-year point. So this is the downside of platforms, it's very difficult to experiment at times. How have you coped with that over the years? What's been your approach?
I think you kind of touched on it earlier, right? All of these things are entirely people-centric. If you can get past I have a fear that my budget will be cut or reallocated, or that my power is diminished in some way, shape or form by the recutting of a budget, if you can get past the hearts and minds of that and go, well, actually it's the right thing to do for the organization and the strategy we're chasing, then the mechanics of getting it done, yes, it's difficult, but it's a lot easier when people aren't, staunchly standing against it and pushing back and not releasing info and not playing the game. So I almost feel like it's a human problem more than a technical one.
Yeah, I think you're on the money there. I'm just in the last few chapters of a very, very good book your listeners might be interested in. It's called Radical Uncertainty. And Mervyn King and John Kay wrote it last year. They're very good writers, very good observers, and a really tremendous view of how you navigate a world where uncertainty has become a daily aspect of our lives. And they go back to clarity of strategy, and in particular, how poor human beings are at expressing strategy. Clear expression of purpose and goals and strategies of being the how you're going to get there is the answer. And executives need to actually step back a little bit and not feel like they have to know everything. And they do need to start trusting. They need to set the goals with incredible clarity. we need to do this. This is, and then let the how be set by people who are now closer to those systems, who are subject matter experts, who can look at the processes and go, well, this is the best compromise to fit with that, and we'll need to change these things accordingly. I really love their analysis and their kind of the landscape they draw around uncertainty, and it makes it's just going to get worse, mate. Like, it's never going back to a world where you could have a budget, a 3-year budget, effectively, a 5-year business plan, and maybe a quarterly reforecast where you'll move a couple of $100. The world's never going back there.
No. My last question was going to be, what do you think's next in this space? But I think we kind of covered it in terms of, I guess, dealing with uncertainty and probably complexity theory. You got any other thoughts on that?
I have. I've got a giant theory of what is. So people ask me, well, come on, you're the godfather of Agile. What's the next Agile thing? And I think I've found it. I found it by absolute accident last summer reading The Innovation Delusion. And that's a tremendous book, particularly for a bloke who used to have a job title Chief Inventor, because it just goes to town on the delusion that in the last 20 years we've created tremendous innovation and added an enormous amount of value to the global economy and society, when in fact most of the things we've been building were based on technology developed between 1985 and the year 2000. Their view is that actually look for much more opportunity to innovate in the operations. So in running stuff, and I believe running stuff is going to be the next Agile. 2 reasons. One, like being good at running stuff is actually like very satisfying. And number 2, it's actually this, because you're closer to customers. If you're running things, it's like the goal, the ancient Eli Goldratt book about the factory. That tells you why running stuff is incredibly important. Toyota would tell you the same. The person close to the work sees the struggles and sees the opportunities. So they've formed the maintainer movement. They've just got a website. And this all started as a bit of a joke amongst academics who were getting very frustrated at the arm-wavy innovation theorists and chief inventors hogging all the conferences and getting all the airtime. And they're going, no, actually, I think there's an elegance in being good at running stuff. And they hooked up with the right to repair movement. And that's a very big movement in America where companies have, John Deere and all those big manufacturers, you buy a fixed computer with a service contract. You're not allowed to fix your tractor. And that's actually touched a very sore point with, farming communities particularly, who are reliant. They can't have a technologist come out and service their tractor in the midst of harvesting 10,000 acres of corn in the Midwest. They just want to change the oil filter, but you're not allowed to. You void your warranty if you do that kind of thing. They're completely sealed systems. So the maintainer movement hooked up with the right to repair movement has become enormous. And their insight is that running things well becomes the source of your next ideas and the source of innovation, as well as having the great benefit of making your company profitable.
There you go. So I had a really interesting tangent from that, which was what's next. And I think you sort of touched on at the beginning there, was the innovation that have been talking about for the last decade is largely built on top of tech that was built 20, 30 years ago. And I mentioned I was at a conference last week in Sydney, and there was a lot of conversation around Web3 and blockchain and what have you. And I think one of the insights that I took away from that was, because we're trying to explain a new concept in terms of what is blockchain and to people to try and make them understand it, we draw parallels with things that exist. We end up with NFT art, right? Or it's like old school art on the wall and it's a thing, and people are going, okay. But again, the struggle with that is by constraining our thinking to things that already exist to try and draw parallels so people can kind of understand this new murky, scary thing. We're missing the point that the innovation that will come in the next 5-10 years will largely be based on this, let's call it next evolution of blockchains and what have you, that aren't 30-year-old technology, although there's a lot of thinking behind it from that back then. But you know what I mean? It's that we don't know what's going to be based on yet, because this is relatively new in terms of people getting their hands on it and understanding what the next innovation looks like?
Yeah, what I do see is a kind of a separation now, thinking about what McKinsey called Horizon 2 and 3, which is what we did at REA Group. We formed REA Labs, and the brief is quite simple. Lots of innovation in the short term going on in Horizon 1, finding better ways of running things and building platforms and doing all those kind of things. But someone should be thinking about where's the blue sky in 2 to 5 years? What's coming down the pipeline? The challenge with that is all feels very uncomfortable, talking about the metaverse, talking about peer-to-peer payments. Well, there's a lot of stakeholders don't want the payments infrastructure of this country to change 1 inch. And they're powerful. They're the oldest institutions in this country. So, yeah, the forces against it are significant, but that is exactly it. I'm super optimistic about that because of Generation F. And I wrote about this in the newspaper. And Generation F is Generation Fortnite. So you and I won't be the generation that probably drive much of the change in the next 20 years. It's going to be these kids coming into the workforce. And I'm talking the next 3 years. So look out, workforce. I don't know. Have you seen Fortnite, Minecraft, those kind of games?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absorbing a lot of family time in lockdown, that's for sure. Kids playing those are learning a skill set I never learned from Space Invaders at the fish and chip shop. So they're learning collaboration. You cannot win those games without collaboration, and they're far more fun if you do. So learning to collaborate like this in headsets, what a future skill that is. Strategy. You actually can't, unless you're thinking about what your future state is and how, and then going down the cascade of, okay, my goal is to get to that point, or my goal is to build this, and then I'll come back. And they're native strategy thinkers. I didn't learn that. Strategy wasn't a thing that was any part of my life as a teenager. Their ability to learn is incredible. They don't differentiate between playing Minecraft and watching a YouTube video on how to solve this problem in Minecraft. Same thing. Imagine that with work, where someone doesn't see a difference between working and learning how to improve something. There's not the mindset of my generation. Learning, doing, two completely different functions. They just, the communication speed suits a VUCA world. The worst moment's going to be you and I sitting in a corporate strategy meeting as shareholders of a company, right? And around us is a new generation. And the CEO puts up a PowerPoint slide on the screen with, this is the strategy, and it's a house with 4 pillars on it. And then proceeds to spend 45 minutes explaining the pillars. Okay, well, you're talking about a generation of new workers who use TikTok to transfer rich quantities of information in 15 seconds. That's another liminal time. And I'm just so excited about witnessing their impact on our workplaces. They could create some chaos, and they can also really change things really fast.
I think it's also interesting that I was recently talking to some people who are working in the UK market, and they said that the current generation of people coming through aren't interested in dealing with traditional banks. They're all getting onto the neobanks and the app-based stuff, right? And you think about the next generation of kids that come through, as you say, that are working in the Fortnite world. Yes, there will be pushbacks from the big institutions on, we don't want to change the way things work, but these guys will probably come through and go, I don't care. I'll deal with the neos because they'll move.
That's it. Look to China. So if people want to know what's coming here, look to China. I'm super lucky to have colleagues in Shanghai who are, their clients are Alibaba, those kind of, it's all the same thing. The community ecosystem WeChat thing is also the payments infrastructure. It's also the marketplace. Their shape of their economy and society is very different, and that's the place for us all to look, because that's definitely coming our way. Change happens slowly though. Don't cut the chrysalis open, and we'll just wake up one morning and absolutely, none of us are going to have bank accounts, and we'll all be just touching our phones on each other and paying back for dinner.
All right, mate. We're up on time. There's a lot to distill here, but I think the key messages are complexity is certain, if you want to call it that.
Get ahead of it.
Yeah. And the sooner you try and solve these problems in your journey, the cheaper and quicker and easier they'll be to solve.
Play one level above where you are. If you're a 15-person company, play like you're 150. If you're heading north of 100 because you've been venture funded and you're on scale up and profitability, think like a 500-person company. Think like a grown-up. Think about customer management. Think about payments. Think about job descriptions and like strategy like a grown-up, and you will have an absolutely fine time of it.
Yeah, and I reckon distilling that is think about it people first. Like the tech's great, having platform strategy is great, but who's going to run it? Who's going to scale it? Who's going to innovate on it?
Yeah, for all of the changes in the last 30 years, I think the adage that the cost of software, 80% of it occurs after you've deployed it onto a server and start using it, still holds true, even with software as a service platform software. And that's when it's about people and process and adapting and listening to customers. And yeah, like, sure, you worry about your business case for $200,000 to put that platform in. Think about 5 years.
Yeah, 100%. All right, mate. Thanks for your time. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Another jab in the ribs. You'll get there eventually.
I will. I'll tell you, if you produced 2 in the time it took me to produce 1, I won't be surprised.
All right, mate. Thank you once again, and we'll talk soon.
Very good. Have a great day.
You've been listening to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams. To find out about how Shane enables digital businesses to scale, please visit shanewilliams.com.au. Thank you for listening.